Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to call this hearing to order. I want to start by taking a moment to thank our ranking member, Senator Capito, her staff, and other members of our committee here today for joining us to kick off this discussion for the development of the next Water Resources Development Act, affectionately known as WRDA. I'm very proud of our successful bipartisan work on water infrastructure so far this Congress, including passage of our drinking water and clean water bill by a margin of 89-2 in the Senate. And negotiations, I think, continue with respect to a bipartisan infrastructure package. But I'm color me more hopeful today than I've been in a while, so we'll see how that works out. I'm grateful for the opportunity that WRDA affords us to review the Army Corps' operations every 2 years. This is an agency facing an extraordinarily important and difficult task with a list of worthy projects far outstripping the resources that are available to it. Indeed, due to a rampant underfunding for a number of years, the backlog of authorized but not completed projects has grown to over $100 billion. I think the number is $109 billion. And that's more than 15 times the agency's annual operating budget, which should be a concern to all of us. Clearly, there is something wrong with this picture. And when demand for projects so outstrips the supply of resources, the Corps is placed in an untenable position. And moreover, its decision-making process is growing far more difficult as we all struggle to address the needs of small, rural, and often disadvantaged communities, as well as the infrastructure straining impacts of sea level rise, more intense storms, pervasive droughts, and other climate change consequences. My hope is that today's hearing will provide us with important insights into all these challenges as we begin to work on our next WRDA bill. I look forward to hearing testimony. We look forward to hearing testimony from our stakeholders today about their experiences with the Corps to inform us as we set priorities for the next authorization bill. Understanding that our concerns with the adequacy of Corps funding are universal and will be a key focus of negotiations with the administration and our colleagues on the Appropriations Committee. I'd like to focus today on the upcoming challenges presented by small, worthwhile, but oftentimes overlooked projects and the magnifying problems associated with changing climate. For some time, I've spoken about the current process for evaluating benefits and costs of the Corps projects shortchanges our abilities to address the critical needs in smaller, economically disadvantaged communities, including those in rural and tribal areas, sometimes referred to as the least of these. Because the benefit-to-cost ratio, affectionately referred to as BCR, does not account for the regional and local economic benefits of a project, a number of communities that need federal investment, the most are the last to receive it because the benefits associated with the construction of projects in these areas are not great enough to register as significant on a national scale. Thus, from the perspective of the White House Office of Management and Budget, these projects oftentimes don't make the cut. In the 2020 WRDA law, our committee provided the Corps with flexibility and the authority to partner with rural and economically disadvantaged communities. However, those 2020 provisions were just the tip of the iceberg of what is needed. And we need to do more for communities that depend on federal investment for essential flood and storm protection. Along with a number of other states, Delaware and West Virginia and Rhode Island have oftentimes ended up on the short end of the stick when it comes to federal investments in Corps projects, Corps infrastructure. And we'll continue to explore ways to expand the Corps' programs to better reach the small rural communities and states that all of us represent. We witness on an almost daily basis how the states of all of us on this dais are being increasingly hammered by increasingly powerful storms, more devastating floods, encroaching sea levels, and seemingly endless droughts. And the Corps has been thrust into the position of prime defender against these all too frequent and increasingly costly disasters. To be better able to respond to climate change, the Corps needs to update its economic assessments as well as its engineering standards to ensure the nation's infrastructure is resilient to these impacts of climate change. In short, the Corps needs to take a longer view with climate consequences in clear focus. As my colleagues frequently hear me say, maybe too frequently hear me say, The state of Delaware is the lowest lying state in the nation, as Colin knows. Our highest point of land is a bridge. And we are acutely aware of the need to develop solutions that not only work today, but also will protect us well into the future. Incorporating natural infrastructure into our resilience efforts in Delaware has proven a critical element of those long-term solutions. And we'd like to see the Corps embrace and use natural infrastructure solutions more broadly as a tool to respond to climate change. We also need for the Corps to plan for the new climate reality that we face. Failure to do so is extremely costly. From 1990 through 2019, the Corps received $53.9 billion, that's $53.9 billion in supplemental appropriations. The majority of that money was for flood risk projects, typically in response to flooding disasters and severe storms. Over the last decade, these funds have more than doubled the Corps' construction program for flood risk reduction projects. We shouldn't be waiting for the storms to address these projects. We should be addressing these initiatives before the storms ever arrive. The trick is to prevent these massive losses in the first place. So let's begin our work on WRDA this year with equity and climate goals more in mind than before. And with that, I want to turn over to Senator Capito for her opening remarks and say how much we look forward to working on this project, this legislative project, together with her and members of this committee on both sides they are, from Iowa all the way to Rhode Island and back. Thank you. Senator Capito.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to working on this as well. It's that time again when the committee begins the biennial process of crafting water resources legislation. As the chairman said, WRDA, the Water Resources Development Act, authorizes water resource projects and sets national policies for the Civil Works Program of the U.S. Corps of Engineers. The Corps' main mission area of navigation, flood risk management, and ecosystem restoration support the lives and livelihoods of millions of Americans and facilitates commerce throughout this country and internationally. As I noticed in the previous hearing, 2.3 billion short tons of goods and commodities were transported over water in the United States in just 1 year. This is made possible by the nation's ports and inland waterway systems constructed and maintained by the Corps. According to the Corps' own estimates, its flood risk management projects have prevented over $1 trillion in riverine and coastal flood damages, mostly within the last 35 years. These projects and activities, in addition to other important mission areas, are authorized and directed by Congress under WRDA. The most recent WRDA legislation enacted by Congress in 2020 included several provisions that are important to the country and my home state of West Virginia. Importantly, the legislation changed the cost share for projects on the inland waterways system, included provisions to support the development of projects in rural and economically disadvantaged communities, and provided assistance to non-federal sponsors on identifying flood risk management project deficiencies. I was glad to secure an increase in authorization of $160 million for West Virginia's 2 environmental infrastructure programs under the Corps, which help support our drinking water and wastewater projects in the state. But there's much more to do, as you said, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to working with the chairman and my colleagues to develop the next WRDA bill. It's important that future WRDA legislation supports the development and delivery of water resources projects in communities that need them, while continuing to meet our national priorities. This is underscored by events such as the 2016 flood in West Virginia, which claimed 23 lives and destroyed over 1,000 homes. We are still waiting on initial funding for a comprehensive study by the Corps to assess existing flood protection gaps and inform future projects in the Kanawha River Basin where most of the damage in the 2016 flood occurred. While I fully intend to see that this study receives a new start, it will do little good if recommended projects are held up due to analysis that sort of disregard the needs of certain communities. In that same vein, it is also important that Congress promote efficiencies in the Corps project delivery process to support its central missions. The Corps decision-making process is often perceived as a black box by non-federal sponsors without the requisite expertise or experience, and this should change. The Congress should continue to encourage and enhance assistance on the part of the Corps to communities and non-federal sponsors. People on the ground know what their water resource challenges are, and the experiences and expertise of the hardworking men and women at the Corps can help inform them of paths forward to address those challenges. As we make these changes, and other changes, however, it is important that we do not become too overly prescriptive. Our nation's water resources are diverse. As I said, communities know better about their unique needs than policymakers here. So we must preserve the important role of non-federal sponsors in the development and delivery of projects. In closing, let me reiterate my gratitude for our witnesses for being here today, and I thank Chairman Carper for having this hearing. The mission of the Corps is ever more critical than ever, and the testimony we hear today will inform this committee as it continues its integral role. Mr. Chairman, I would like to take a point and introduce my a friend of mine, but also a great West Virginian who's on our panel before we begin our testimony.
I'm not going to ask the witnesses to stand up, but we got a couple of tall, really tall guys here. Amy, you're right between them.
Well, I'm really...
Take it away.
Take it away. I'm really pleased to have with us today Robert Mccoy from Sissonville, West Virginia. Robert and I have known each other for several years. He's the president and CEO of Amherst Madison, which employs over 350 people, and they are a marine transportation, construction, and repair business that's been in business since 1893. Robert is a father of two, a daughter who is at the University of Charleston and a 14-year-old son. He went to West Virginia State University. He was born in Matewan, and we're really happy, Robert, that you're here. And Mr. Chairman, you have to know, since you're the one who can crack the funniest jokes, this is the real McCoy right here. I know. He's probably heard it 100 times. Anyway, welcome, Robert, and all the other witnesses. Thank you.
All right, that was good. I understand we're being joined by Mario Cordero remotely. Is that correct? Yeah. And he's the executive director of the Port of Long Beach, California. He's also an attorney and the current chairman of the board of the American Association of Port Authorities. Mario was a midshipman many years ago, Navy ROTC midshipman. I was stationed on a big 1,000-foot-long jumbo oiler Navy ship at the Long Beach Naval Station. So I have some fond memories of Long Beach and the time that I spent there that year. Mr. Cordero is also an attorney and the current chairman of the board of American Association of Port Authorities. Welcome, bienvenido. Our second witness is Colin Romero, and Colin is the president and the chief executive officer of the National Wildlife Federation, America's largest wildlife conservation organization with 53 state and territorial affiliates and nearly 6 million hunters, anglers, birders, gardeners, hikers, paddlers, and wildlife enthusiasts. That's a lot of people. Prior to leading the National Wildlife Federation, Colin led the Delaware Department of Natural Resources, Environmental Control as our cabinet secretary from 2009 and 2014. Did a great job, and we have very fond memories of his service in our state. We're proud to claim him as our own. Our third witness is Amy Larson. Amy is the founding partner of Larson Strategies, LLC, and has more than 25 years of water resources and waterways transportation policy and funding expertise. And now we look forward to hearing from our panel of witnesses, and we're going to start with Mario Cordero. Mr. Cordero, you are recognized for your statement. Please proceed.
Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to provide remarks to the Environmental and Public Works Committee on examining the benefits of investing in the USA CE water infrastructure projects. I'm Mario Cordero, Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach. The Port of Long Beach is the second largest containerized cargo port in the United States and is a major economic contributor to our local, state, and national economy. Maritime traffic moves in excess of 80 million tons annually through the port, which drives 200 billion annual economic activity and supports 2.6 million U.S. jobs and more than 576,000 jobs in Southern California. I'm speaking on behalf of the American Association of Port Authorities, AAPA, as its chairman. My remarks today will focus on port experiences partnering with the Corps, planning for resiliency, sea level rise, and priorities for future legislation. AAPA members appreciate that Congress understands the importance of our seaports' role in the U.S. economy. Seaports and their maritime partners sustain 31 million jobs and generate economic activity representing 26% of the U.S. economy. Constructing and maintaining the nation's 21st century maritime infrastructure is essential to the nation's economic future. Public ports and their private sector partners are committed to this challenge, with plans to invest upwards of $155 billion by 2025 in port-related facilities. These investments can only be fully realized with the federal navigation assets managed by the Corps of Engineers and are kept modern and in a state of good repair. I thank the Environmental and Public Works Committee members for their landmark WRDA 2020 legislation, which resolved the longstanding issue of the full use of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund with equitable distribution for all ports, small ports, national defense ports, and donor and energy transfer ports. AEPA members are pleased that the House Fiscal Year 2022 Energy and Water Development Appropriations Bill has established a precedent for supporting this funding level. We look forward to the WRDA 2020 funds distribution approach when full implementation is effective in September 2022. Federal navigation channels are the foundation of global freight movement. We have all witnessed the important role of ports and the supply chain through the COVID-19 pandemic, where ports and our local partners and our labor partners were able to stay open and safely move freight like personal protective equipment. These channels and port facilities must keep pace with the increasing size of the global fleet of ships. If we don't, we risk losing the water transportation cost savings that makes products like agricultural export competitive in the global marketplace. At the Port of Long Beach, our deep draft navigation improvement feasibility study, performed in collaboration with the United States Army Corps of Engineers, was conducted to identify opportunities to remove constraints, improve efficiencies, and reduce transportation costs. Based on fiscal year 2021 discount rate of 2.5% and a 50-year period of analysis, the equivalent annual benefits and costs are estimated at $20 million and $5 million respectively. The project is estimated to provide annual net benefits of $15 million and a benefit to cost ratio of 3.6. In addition to navigation improvements, we are embarking on a $5 billion project to repair wharves and have identified approximately $140 million in maritime infrastructure repair and replacement projects, including wharves, rock dikes, bulkheads needed to prevent potential impacts to critical port business operations. The Port of Long Beach has been proactive in strategically preparing for adapting climate change, including impacts associated with sea level rise, coastal hazards through our climate adaptation coastal resiliency plan. This plan, the first of its kind of a North American seaport, includes adaptive measures to address sea level and other risks to ensure continuity for port operations and protective to local communities surrounding the port. AAPA members report that WRDA legislation has led to profound improvements in core process. For example, the 3-year feasibility study process, partnering improvements with the non-federal sponsors being actively involved in the core, and aligning dredge projects with fill projects for the beneficial and reuse of dredged material. AAPA has 3 key issues for the WRDA as follows. 1, authorize for both new studies and navigation channel improvements, and proceed to as well as construct navigation project improvements recommended by the Chief of Engineer reports. 2, visibility of the core plans to restore and properly maintain federal navigation projects with the increased funding for full use of Harbor Maintenance Trust Funds revenues established by WRDA 2020. 3, continue to identify process improvement for improved project delivery. AAPA will submit the list of specific streamlined improvements soon. And finally, I want to thank the committee leaders, members, and staff for their efforts to ensure port-related infrastructure like federal navigation channels, jetties, and breakwaters as part of any infrastructure investment legislation being developed. AEPA estimates that $3 billion will provide completion for funding of federal share of current level navigation and channel improvements. I commend the committee and the leadership for recognizing the nexus between water resource development, economic prosperity, and I urge you to develop and pass both an infrastructure package and WRDA legislation at the earliest possible time. I'm happy to address any questions you may have, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak on behalf of AAPA.
We appreciate very much you joining us, and thank you for that testimony, Mr. Cordero. Next is Colin Romero, and Colin, you may begin when you are ready. Please proceed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Carper. Ranking Member Capito, it's great to be with all of you today. Thank you for the invitation to testify on the vital issue of improving the resilience of our water resources and the community and wildlife that those resources sustain. Look, this conversation comes at a critical time. The flooding that we're seeing, the hurricane, above average hurricane season, and it's time for some real talk because we're facing real risks. The ranking member talked about the flood of 2016. We can talk about Hurricane Sandy. It's hitting every part of the country, and it's affecting lives, livelihoods, perpetuating historic inequalities. And at the same time, we're seeing in places where we have healthy wetlands, streams, rivers, shorelines, they're protecting us from these extreme weather events. And we're also seeing the devastating consequences when these systems have been paved over or degraded. Unfortunately, despite this kind of escalating damage that we're seeing, resilience investments are only proposed maybe 1%, maybe 2% of the infrastructure package, both the bipartisan piece and what comes after. This is woefully inadequate. There's virtually nothing for the Army Corps in many of these proposals right now of any magnitude. And we believe we need at least $36 billion to make these investments in the coming years. And this is just simply pound foolish, as the chairman laid out. We know that every dollar that we spend in resilience is going to save us $6 to $8 in avoided damages, avoided costs. But because of our budget rules, we score the $1 and we don't account for the $6. And then you all should fight with appropriations trying to get resources. And it's costing us hundreds of billions of dollars in impacts. I mean, because of these rules, it's easier to spend hundreds of billions of dollars after the fact, after the disaster occurs, than it is to invest in that ounce of prevention that could have mitigated the damage in the first place. And as a result, we spent almost $300 billion in the last 10 years on supplemental disaster appropriations, a fraction of which could have funded a lot of the backlog, a third of which could have funded the backlog that Senator Carper talked about. So the evidence is incredibly clear that the best way to protect communities most cost effectively is to restore the natural systems. It's hard to believe that Hurricane Sandy was almost 10 years ago, but since then, coastlines and floodplain communities have been pummeled by disaster after disaster. As we've shown in a recent report, the protective value of nature, prioritizing the protection and restoration of wetlands and other natural systems would have saved billions upon billions of dollars in the past and would save even more in the years ahead. As Senator Whitehouse said just yesterday, this year is the worst year of the last 10. It's going to be the best year of the next 10. We need to avoid the unintended consequences also that can be created by structural solutions that just push the floodwater into other communities. So as we experience more frequent weather events, the Army Corps really needs a new playbook, one that treats nature as an ally. The Army Corps has been asked to fight against nature for almost 2 centuries, embedding this approach into its organizational structure and its very DNA. But we know now that healthy systems are essential for our well-being and our survival. Building upon the important provisions from the previous Water Resources Development Act and ones before that, we must accelerate this thinking towards natural systems, as Senator Carper mentioned. We must overcome the Corps' entrenched over-reliance on structural solutions, overhaul the siloed approach to project planning, and to establish an integrated approach that works with nature to bolster resilience and protect communities. We have 4 specific recommendations. First, we urge the committee to make critically needed reforms to the Corps cost-benefit analysis, the benefit-cost analysis process. It's a process that's fundamentally broken in several ways. To make the best choice among alternatives, the Corps must properly account for all costs and all benefits, including risk reduction from flooding, water quality improvements, soil stabilization, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, expanded recreational opportunities. If these benefits are lost to a project, they should also be counted as a project cost. Second, we encourage the committee to continue to focus on environmental justice, as you have in the SRF debates a few months ago. By directing the Corps to focus more on remediating toxic pollution in industrial and urban waterway projects in places like the Ohio River, the Delaware River, the lower Mississippi. We encourage expanding the pilot project in economically distressed communities, as Senator Capito just mentioned. We suggest establishing a senior advisor for environmental justice and environmental justice advisory council, advancing innovation in this space, and hiring more folks of color and contracting more with minority businesses across the Corps. Third, we urge Congress to establish a resilience directorate to ensure that resilience measures, especially the restoration of natural systems, are fully integrated and leveraged across flood protection, navigation, ecological restoration business lines, which is really essential to protect communities, advance equitable solutions, and protect wildlife. To be effective, this kind of interdepartmental directorate should be within the Office of the Chief of Engineers and have significant budget authority. And fourth, we must vastly improve the condition and collaboration with the Fish and Wildlife Service and state, territorial, and tribal wildlife agencies to recover thousands of at-risk fish and wildlife species that live in core project areas. These reforms will take a concerted bipartisan push to shift centuries of planning and practices at the core, but they will bear immense benefits to people and wildlife alike, saving lives and money in the process. On behalf of the National Wildlife Federation, I just want to thank you for committing to making these types of reforms and leveraging nature as an ally. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks so much for joining us and for just really excellent testimony. Our next witness is Amy Larson, and Ms. Larson, you are recognized for your statement. Please proceed. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. It's a privilege for me to appear before you this morning to testify on the benefits of investing in Army Corps of Engineers water resources infrastructure projects. My name is Amy Larson. I'm currently a consultant, but previously served for 12 years as the president of the National Waterways Conference, an association whose membership includes the non-federal sponsors of Corps Civil Works projects, as well as the stakeholders who rely upon those projects and the multiple benefits they bring to this nation. This morning, I'd like to address the importance of flood control and flood risk management measures to small and rural communities. I'll touch upon the opportunities those communities may face or may have, as well as impediments they face, and offer suggestions for more effective planning and investment strategies going forward. We hear a lot about the traditional planning process, and we know that it generally produces the recommended plan as the one that has the greatest net economic benefit consistent with protecting the environment. But a particular challenge with this metric is that the BCR considers the value of real estate in the proposed project area. And what that means is it's a clear detriment to regions with lower property values. And if we look at this administration's emphasis on equity and environmental justice, we know that we need a more focused response to address flood risks in these disadvantaged communities. An alternative approach could be to consider, for example, the number of homes, structures, and most significantly, lives at stake, rather than simply economic benefits. Consideration of life safety should be paramount, derived from the Corps' focus on risk-informed decision-making rather than a straight economic analysis. There's also a major disconnect, though, when it comes to funding projects. In establishing the administration's budget priorities, and this goes back over several administrations, OMB uses a BCR of 2.5 to 1 at a 7% discount rate. In practical terms, that means many authorized projects simply won't be included in the president's budget. So while the administration's FY22 budget would lower that to 2 to 1, the unrealistic 7% remains a huge hurdle for many projects to get started. There are other alternative funding opportunities that may help these small communities that don't typically avail themselves of the large planning process. So the Continuing Authorities Program is designed to plan and implement projects of limited size, scope, and complexity. And typically the feasibility study here at $100,000 is 100% federally funded. And thereafter, if a decision is made to construct, there is a cost share model. So if we look at the CAP authorities, the Section 205, which looks at small flood control projects, the cost share is 65% federal and 35% non-federal. While that's a great program, if we look at the actuals, it's only estimated that about 20% of those projects that go through the study phase go on to construction. And there's pretty much two reasons for this. These small communities simply do not have the funds for their local cost share. And second, they don't have the technical expertise to manage their end of the project. So in funding CAP in FY21, Congress gave $69.5 million. That's compared to $3 million in the administration's budget. So that's a good step, and you've mentioned the WRDA 2020 provision, which established a pilot program for these small and rural communities at 100% cost share. What I would encourage you to do when you are at your town halls is encourage your local communities, avail themselves of these CAP opportunities. Go to the local Corps district, express interest in this project, because what happens is they finally get a budget, and then the Corps has to ramp this up. If there's a letter of interest with the Corps district, the communities then will be called by the Corps and be able to work and try to move forward on their CAP programs. We can't forget also long-term operation and maintenance activities in order to have sustainable solutions for this. So how do they pay for that? That's one of the things that we know falls by the wayside with these small flood control projects is the O&M. So I've looked at other programs within the Corps and other federal agencies that may provide this committee guidance as you seek to help these small and rural communities. The Corps' Tribal Partnership Program, the Corps' CWIFIA program, EPA's WIFIA, TIFIA, Department of Agriculture and HUD have zero to low interest loans. They may provide some sort of model so that these communities who are in need can get their cost shares for construction and for O&M. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to any questions.
You're great to join us. Thank you for that testimony. And now, the real McCoy. Mr. McCoy, take it away.
Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today on the benefits of investing in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers water infrastructure projects.
You know, if I closed my eyes, I'd feel like I was back in my native state of West Virginia.
You'd be right.
A great sound.
My comments today will highlight the improvements made in the Water Resources and Development Act of 2020, also known as WRDA, and why a comprehensive infrastructure bill that includes significant funding for lock and dam modernization will provide and sustain more jobs, increase efficiency, and make our inland waterways system more resilient. As Ranking Member Capito said earlier, my name is Robert McCoy. I am the President and CEO of Amherst Madison. Amherst Madison is a 100% employee-owned company involved in the transportation, construction, and repair business. We're based on the Kanawha River in Charleston, West Virginia. I also serve as a trustee of the National Waterways Foundation, as a member of the Board of Directors of Waterways Council. WCI is the national public policy organization that advocates for modern and well-maintained system of inland waterways and ports. Our nation's rivers are the fourth R of a critical national multimodal transportation system that also includes roads, rails, and runways. The inland waterway system is comprised of 12,000 miles of navigable waterways in 38 states. The United States has the largest navigable inland waterway system in the world. Each year, the system typically moves almost 600 million tons of freight, valued at approximately $250 billion. River transportation is the safest, most environmentally responsible, and efficient mode of transporting bulk commodities. I would like to thank this committee for continuing to prioritize the biennial enactment of WRDAs, and especially thank you for Section 109 of WRDA 2020. Section 109 of WRDA 2020 established an important new statutory cost share formula for the construction and major rehabilitation of inland waterways navigation projects receiving an appropriation in the next 10 years. That provision changed the construction and major rehabilitation cost share for inland navigation projects to 65% from the General Treasury, 35% from the Inland Waterways Trust Fund. When fully appropriated, it will deliver roughly an additional $100 million annually in construction funding for navigation improvements. I cannot thank this committee enough for your support in adjusting the cost share. The Inland Waterways User Board is a federal advisory committee established by Congress to give commercial users a strong voice in the Corps investment decisions. I have included with my written testimony a copy of the User Board's most recent report and recommendations. Congress created the Users Board to work with the Corps of Engineers to help prioritize construction projects through what is called the Capital Investment Strategy. In January of this year, the Corps submitted the first update of the Capital Investment Strategy that this committee called for in WRDA 2014. The Corps' 2020 Capital Investment Strategy report illustrates that by completing 15 congressionally authorized priority projects valued at $7 billion over a 10-year time frame, rather than the expected 30-year baseline funding scenario, Corps will save $2.2 billion. By including capital construction funding for the inland waterways in a positive manner in the comprehensive infrastructure legislation that Congress currently is developing, you will create a sustainable advantage to American industries that ship their products on our waterways, making those industries more competitive at home and in the world market. Both WCI and the Inland Waterways User Board have recommended at least $3 billion of infrastructure funds should be appropriated in the comprehensive infrastructure investment legislation for for the capital investment strategy list of 15 congressionally authorized projects. That concludes my testimony. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions.
Mr. McCoy, great to hear from you this morning. Thank you very much for joining us and for your testimony as well. I want to start off the questioning with a question for each of our panelists. And what I'd like to ask each of you to do, and we'll start with Mr. Cordero, but just share with us maybe the three top issues, maybe the biggest issues that you believe we should be tackling with the next Water Resources Development Act. Maybe the top three, just briefly. And Mr. Cordero, would you lead us off, please, with that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what you gather here this morning is addressing the benefit to cost ratio. Obviously, it's too rigid, and we need to have the issue of including natural infrastructure as part of this dynamic. You know, we need to have a way to capture and quantify natural infrastructure with regard to these assessments. Now, going forward, again, I think you've heard the very important issues of climate change. Sea level rise is a big issue for coastal community and ports. So I think number one, that's essential. And I think going forward, again, if we move forward to address natural infrastructure, as an example, sediment, you know, using sediment as a result of what we get from our dredging projects in a more environmentally friendly way and for those purposes. So I think those are a couple of key issues that I think I want to leave with this committee.
Yeah, good. Thank you for those. Mr. Romero.
Thank you. In addition to more resources in general, and I think there are some fundamental changes that are needed, and I think you've heard from the entire panel around the benefit cost analysis. One specific change on that, making sure we count increases in ecological services as a benefit, but also the loss of ecological functions as a cost would make a lot of the numbers pencil in a way that's more reflective of the impact of the project. So that's one. The second one is the idea of this resilience directorate that I mentioned, this idea of shifting the way that we design and execute projects across business lines. And then third, really embedding environmental justice and wildlife into the bones of the DNA of the Army Corps. Those three would make a huge difference.
Good, thank you. Ms. Larson, please, same question. Three, maybe a couple of the biggest issues you think we ought to be tackling as we undertake this legislative challenge.
So the BCR is at the top of the list for a lot of non-federal sponsors, and this is particularly true where non-federal sponsors are seeking to modify their projects and include multiple benefits. And you heard in the testimony last month from Rick Johnson from the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, the challenge with modifying a flood control project to include recreation, protection, irrigation, agriculture benefits. So I think, pulling apart and delving into how the BCR is derived is really important. But I would suggest we need to get this right, because we do still need a planning process that is consistent, it's predictable, it's replicable. It should provide the planners, federal investments, and non-federal sponsors some consistency. What we don't want is let's throw every possible benefit into the pot and come up with a subjective mix, because that will lead to a waste of federal and local resources. So a consistable, practicable planning framework, I think, is really important. Part of that is how to quantify all of these multiple benefits. So that, I think, is really important. Similarly, considering regional benefits. How do we quantify those and ensure that there is still a federal interest and federal incentive to invest in these projects? And what does that mean? Secondary and tertiary benefits as well. I would also say that, there are a lot of ideas out here. And one of the false narratives, in my view, that typically comes up, and we've seen this through WRDA 14 up till now, is this battle between gray and green. It's not a conflict. It can be an all-of-the-above solution. So I think anything that goes forward is an all-of-the-above solution that doesn't add additional bureaucratic hurdles to non-federal sponsors and federal planners alike.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Mr. McCoy?
The most relevant issue I see is continuing the progress this committee has achieved recently by securing funding for the inland waterways priority projects. Currently, over 50% of your locks and dams are older than their estimated economic useful life, as determined by the Corps. The inland river system is is just that. It's a system. It's not made up of individual autonomous segments. So the system is as strong as its weakest link. And with structures, over half of your structures being older than their life, I think that's a priority because inland rivers infrastructure has economic features, it has environmental benefits, and it also has flood control benefits as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you finished like right on the money. That never happens. That's pretty impressive. We have 7 minutes set aside for questions for the panel, and you finished on a 000. That's amazing. We've been joined here this morning by Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, former chairman of this committee, and by Senator Kramer. We welcome you both. And speaking in the questioning order right now, looks like Senators Capito, Whitehouse, Inhofe, and Kramer's. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for the increased emphasis on improving the cost-benefit analysis process as we're moving through with the core. And I think that's something that we hear from everybody, so from different sides, but from everybody. So I think that's something that we need to prioritize. Ms. Larson, you mentioned a lot about small and rural communities with the flood risk management projects and how difficult it is to get those funded and off the ground. How can we improve that process? Is it capacity to develop these projects besides the money issue? Can you make some suggestions there?
One of the there's multiple challenges with these small and rural communities. One of these challenges in these small towns is you may have a director of public works, a one-person shop who is responsible for potholes to, levees. And so in the prioritization at the community level, these small flood control projects maybe aren't at the top of the list. So encouraging and educating on CAP and the other authorities that are out there, I think at least gets them in the door. Mm-hmm. Submit the letter of interest to the Corps so that when the local Corps district gets their funding through the appropriations process, they have a queue. They know who is eligible to do that. The other part of this is, as we talk about BCR and looking at the life safety example, if it's based only on NED, there aren't property values to allow that project to compete appropriately. And so we need to look at what is the life safety here and what's being protected. We see all too often that these projects with the higher NED benefits are the ones that get the funding or get a new start. And so that has to be changed. So we need to look at life safety.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you mentioned that in your opening statement. Mr. McCoy, could you, we championed the provision in WRDA 2020 that you mentioned in your statement that changed the construction cost share for navigation projects on the waterways. What effect do you think this will have, changing that cost share? Are you seeing any of the effects of that? I know these things go into a process, but what kind of effect would you see on that, changing the cost share provision?
Changing the cost share had an enormous effect on expediting construction costs on the priority projects of the Corps of Engineers. There's no question. It's saved the nation a lot of money in construction costs, and it's allowed the nation to also recognize the benefits sooner.
And that's, you're seeing that on the waterways that you're using, the upper Ohio all the way down to New Orleans. Don't you go all the way down there, don't you?
Yes, ma'am.
Let me ask you this. I know that in the upper Ohio, a lot of the locks and dams in that area are very old. You mentioned this in your last answer to the last question. Could you kind of quantify that for people? What is a very old lock and dam, and when was the last time it was major maintenance was done on those?
Well, major maintenance is having to be done on an annual basis, and it's costing this country a lot of money because of the age and condition of the infrastructure, particularly Montgomery, Dash Shields, and Emsworth locks. They're well over their design life, and they're in bad shape. So they are certainly costing a lot of O&M dollars, whereas expediting the construction process would save a lot of money on that side.
Does your business have delays and other things that are associated with the inadequacy of those locks to function that holds up commerce?
Yes, there are unplanned outages occurring on the older infrastructure, locks and dams, that that industry does not have an opportunity to respond to. So unfortunately, unlike the highway system, there are no detours on the river. So when you have an unplanned outage or a lock outage, traffic sits still for days, perhaps even weeks, and it's costing the country billions of dollars and ultimately the consumers. And it's also making us non-competitive on the global market.
I know you do a lot of other work besides just transportation. Could you, Mr. O'Mara talked a lot about natural infrastructure and how important that is, and then Ms. Larson talked about, you know, green and gray and all of that. As you're conducting your other business applications at Amherst-Madison, what kind of considerations do you all take for natural infrastructure? Is that something you think about?
A large part of what we do is, as a contractor for the Corps of Engineers, is we dredge. We dredge out the river to provide adequate river depths to allow commerce to continue to flow. Beneficial use of that dredge material is what we've got to do a better job as a country of finding. So yes, we do have to dispose of that, oftentimes incredibly expensive manners, by taking it to landfills. Sometimes we've got to get creative and use it to build environmentally sensitive or environmental structures for fish habitat structures.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks for those questions and for those answers. Senator Whitehouse is faithful in attending the affairs of this committee hearings and business meetings, and it brings a lot of passion to this committee. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you for this hearing. Anytime the Army Corps is the subject of our attention, I like to point out the studious way in which it seems the Army Corps ignores the priorities and wishes of this committee. And I don't think that just making noise from the committee is going to make any appreciable difference in that behavior. So I think as we go forward to do WRDA, we've got to think seriously about actually some protocol for directing the Army Corps' attention to the priorities of this committee. One of my proposals has been to have a hearing for things that have been designated as committee priorities, where the Army Corps can come in and answer for the fact that they don't think it's their priority, so they're not going to do it, and they'll explain to us why they're ignoring committee priorities. But I've been on this committee a while. They've had plenty of chance to change and improve, and I've seen zero interest in doing that. And I say that from a state where our local Army Corps district is terrific. They really try as hard as they can. But up against headquarters, it's an uphill struggle. And I, frankly, am sick of it, and I think we need to have some formal protocol of some kind to make sure that we're being listened to, so that this doesn't, so the Army Corps doesn't believe that it was created by immaculate conception and all of its funding dropped on it by divine intervention, that they understand that this committee has something to do and works pretty hard and needs to be listened to. So that would be point one. As we talk about a new playbook, Mr. O'Mara suggested, I think the new playbook should be some form of protocol to make sure that this committee's priorities are attended to by the Army Corps, or they come and make a, solid explanation of why they're not paying attention to us, why they think what our priorities are wrong priorities, which is fine. We can have that debate. The second is my customary concern with the so-called Flood and Coastal Storm Damage Fund. I repeat, Flood and Coastal Storm Damage Fund, which for FY 2022 is proposed by the Army Corps to spend $1.7 billion. Of that $1.7 billion, $1.67 billion is proposed to be spent inland. That leaves $37 million, not billion, million dollars to be spent on coastal things. We've talked about what's happening to our coast. We've talked about sea level rise. We've talked about worsening storms. We've talked about the ancient infrastructure. Mr. Cordero brings the view of the ports, which are kind of by definition often on the coasts. And Mr. O'Mara talked about a number of issues that are highly specific to coasts. 45-to-1 is the current ratio. $45 inland for every $1 on coasts. it's been worse, believe it or not. In FY 217, it was $120 to inland for every $1 on coast. Now, I know we got some inland states here, and I don't want to take anything away from the inland states, but I don't think 45 to 1 is fair. I don't think it's reasonable. I don't think it's consistent with the risk profile that we face. And as Ms. Larson and other witnesses talk about the concerns of small communities, a hell of a lot of these small communities are small coastal communities who need a lot of support to understand what's coming at them because they've never seen this before. As Mr. O'Mara said, this is probably the worst year of the last 10 or 20 years for a lot of these climate consequences, but it's also probably the best year of the next 10 or 20 years for these climate consequences. And it's these little coastal communities that are not only suffering from all of the disabilities that Ms. Larson described, but they're also suffering from the disability of being on the losing end of a 45 to 1 discrepancy that has no justification whatsoever. And I will confess that my patience is at an end as a senator from the Ocean State with continuing to put up with passing WRDA bills that countenance my state, the chairman's state, Senator Wicker's state, and other coastal states losing out by 45 to 1. That just isn't going to work for me any longer. So we have to find a way through that as well. I appreciate the bipartisanship of the WRDA bills in the past. We've always tried to work together well, but there comes a time when you got to draw a line, and it is really preposterous to have a budget for flood and coastal storm damage, out of which 1.67 billion of the 1.7 billion is going purely to inland, and only $37 million is left for coasts. So thank you for the hearing. I hope somebody at the Army Corps might even be listening to this, and certainly I hope that my committee members are listening to this so that we can find a way to pull together and solve these recurring problems.
Your message is loud and clear and received. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, next up, Senator Inhofe, and after Senator Inhofe, Senator Kramer.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you. And I say to my friend, Senator Whitehouse, that it's loud and clear. We've heard this. And first of all, let me thank you for the respect that you paid to our fallen brother, Mike Enzi, last night by staying there and observing a tribute to him.
You gave a great tribute, Chairman. I was pleased to be there.
Thank you very much. Now, we are obviously, we're inland, and we are concerned, and I think that I've been complimentary in the past, and the equal treatment I have felt has been given. But in the WRDA 2020, I was chairman of the committee at that time, and was able to include the authorization for the West Tulsa the levee system. And we had a devastating flood at that time. I think everyone in the country was aware of that. It's an old levee. You talked about something, one of the witnesses talking about something that was 50 years old. That levee is 80 years old, and it's far beyond its useful life. And finally, I think we're going to be getting some action. Ms. Larson, in your testimony, you note that consideration for life safety should be paramount when evaluating the benefits of flood risk projects. Ms. Larson, how can the Corps take a more expansive view on the benefits of flood risk projects, such as what they did in the Tulsa levee? I really think we could be used as a model for the successes that we had at that time. And any comments about that?
So that the chief's report was successful there because they got an exemption to the standard requirement to pick the NED project. And that was based on life safety risks, comparing the life safety risk versus the NED. And I would suggest that that should not require an exemption. That should be one of those selections that's available so that you don't have to go through what sometimes is a cumbersome process to get that exemption. A challenge going forward I see is that OMB is loath to fund or give New Start status to those projects that aren't at the NED level. And so I think a lot of advocacy continues to be needed to move forward, and hopefully that will serve as a model going forward, that in a community that is protected there, that could be better protected because of the degraded levees, that you need to look at the life safety, what's being protected, the people, the industry, utilities that are behind that levee, and take a look at that. Use that life safety metrics. I would say this will require a complex and deliberative approach. The underlying planning documents that I used to tell NWC members I read so they didn't have to are close to 1,000 pages. They are a bit mind-numbing, and they look at, you know, how do you measure navigation projects through transportation cost savings? How do you look at urban flooding projects? What is the protection to, say, land use? So this will require a long-term effort to review those underlying planning documents, make sure that life safety is not an exception, but is part of the rule.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time here, and I would suggest to you just give those 10,000 pages to Senator Kramer, and he'll explain them all to us. But real quickly, I do want to get one comment in to Mr. McCoy. You know, the American Society of Civil Engineers has given the inland waterways system an overall grade of D+. Now, that kind of is a little bit revealing and somewhat inconsistent with some of the things we've heard. It's clear that we need to address the aging infrastructure, critical maintenance of our nation's inland waterways. On the MCARNs alone, we have $230 million in backlog maintenance, and I've led a delegation letters to the Corps and have submitted congressionally directed spending requests to chip away at that backlog. Mr. McCoy, what is the benefit of investing in and maintaining our inland waterway infrastructure? You know, we're all concerned about it. We live with it on a daily basis. And it happens that a frailty in that system can cost lives. It's a very serious thing. What is your thought about where we are right now?
The benefits, sir, in investing in the infrastructure is twofold. You create a resilient system that is more reliable. It creates jobs. It does so and promotes an industry that is environmentally responsible. It does so in a manner to reduce future O&M responsibilities. With new structures or new earth structures or rebuilt structures, your operation and maintenance costs are going to be reduced. I've had the pleasure of visiting Murray Lock and Dam on the MCARNs, and I've seen those gentlemen from the Corps of Engineers do more with less than most other districts in the country.
I agree with that. Well, that's excellent, and we will stay hooked up with you. And you know, I can't even tell you right now what percentage of that waterway that goes through Arkansas and Oklahoma is actually a 12-foot channel as opposed to a 9-foot channel, because we've been at this thing for so long. But we'll continue to work together as we have in the past with successes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Chairman Carper had to slip out for a minute, so he's handed me the gavel, and I'm going to go to Senator Duckworth, who's joined us on WebEx.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I am very much appreciative of the hearing that we're holding today. We advance, and I'm just so proud of the work that the committee has done this year. We advance, and the Full Senate passed overwhelmingly a bipartisan Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act. Along with the WIA, our Bipartisan Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act is a foundational element in the broader bipartisan infrastructure framework effort. And we are embarking today on another reauthorization of water resources legislation. This committee recognizes the tremendous societal benefits that modern, efficient transportation systems support. Unfortunately, our inland waterway system continues to lag behind what the 21st century global marketplace demands, and many of our riverine ecosystems continue to degrade faster than they can be restored. Mr. McCoy, one of my top priorities in the last WRDA bill was improving the federal cost share for inland waterways projects from 50/50 to 65/35. Please describe some of the benefits this cost share change will have on navigation, interstate commerce, and global competitiveness.
Thank you very much for your question. And thank you very much for supporting the cost share improvement to 65/35. It's created jobs on the construction on the front end of these priority projects that have been congressionally authorized, and on throughout construction. And then at the completion of construction, it has created a more efficient system that's allowed each of the states or the companies that locate and ship product by river to do so in a competitive manner, not only for United States consumption, but for the world market.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Mr. McCoy, WRDA 2020 included a provision that limits the improved inland waterways cost share to 10 years. What, in your view, would consequences be with this 10-year sunset on future projects?
Should the system revert back to the 50/50 cost share, you're going to see a slowing of the new construction or the authorized spending on the 15 priority projects and revert back to a system that is inefficient, and that federal dollars for the construction will increase as time it takes to build the projects. It's proven to be inefficient, and the new cost share is proven to be much more efficient in delivering an infrastructure that's more reliable to the country.
Thank you. Mr. O'Mara, the Upper Mississippi River System, which includes Illinois, the Illinois River, is the only river system designated by Congress as both a nationally significant commercial navigation system and also a nationally significant ecosystem. This Upper Mississippi Illinois waterway transports more than 60% of America's corn and soybean exports. It's home to 25% of North American fish species and is a flyway for 60% of all North American bird species. I often talk about the Corps' Navigation and Ecosystem Sustainability Program, otherwise known as NESP, in terms of lock and dam capacity and infrastructure reliability. But really, NESP ecosystem restoration components would also provide tremendous economic benefits by improving quality of life for local communities and reinforcing the waterway's $25 billion tourism and recreational industry that supports more than 400,000 jobs. Mr. O'Mara, how do ecosystem restoration projects translate into economic benefits for local communities, and how does degradation of riverine ecosystems further marginalize disadvantaged communities?
Thank you, Senator, for your question, and thank you for your incredible leadership of the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative, which will hopefully do a lot of the work that you just highlighted. The economic benefits are huge, and I can talk blue in the face about the flyways and duck hunting and all kinds of things in your neck of the woods, but at the end of the day, restoration means jobs, and every $1 million we spend on restoration can create up to 30 jobs. There's huge benefits to the outdoor recreation economy. There's huge benefits for having clean water that requires less treatment downstream, the flood protection values that come from having healthy wetlands that can absorb 300,000 to 1 million gallons of water, rather than having that flood water wind up in somebody's basement or worse, are huge. And so restoring the healthy systems, and I think there's frankly no better place to pilot some of the large landscape scale investments that we need to do at scale in the middle part of the country than in the Upper Mississippi right now.
Thank you, Mr. O'Mara. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Chair Capito. Thanks also to Chair Carper. It's interesting. Here we are. It's sort of unofficially Infrastructure Week in the Senate, I think. And yeah, who knows for sure, right? But I think we are approaching a vote later today on at least proceeding to the measure on the bipartisan negotiated transportation infrastructure package. I just came from a meeting of some of the negotiators, and I want you to know, Senator Capito and Senator Carper and the team here, the staff, that I asked the very direct, specific question: does the unanimously passed EPW surface transportation bill still serve as the foundation? Every word of it, every word of it. And they assured me that it still is. So I hope that's what you're hearing as well. But so here we come, and here we go, and we're off to the next big infrastructure discussion with you all here as we talk about WRDA. And we've had a lot of discussion, obviously, appropriately, in the committee and today already related to the calculation of the benefit cost ratio that the Corps uses. And I'm sure every member, as you can tell, by the way, there's, as Senator Whitehouse's testimony or questioning attests, nothing unites Republicans and Democrats like the Corps of Engineers. To that, we have to give them a lot of credit for that. But anyway, the end result, frankly, of their process is often that local communities look at the Corps as being out of touch, tone deaf, lacking common sense. I don't know why we pick on the Corps. It's been my observation that most of the bureaucracy it comes off that way. But it's really important that local needs, and in my case, especially rural needs, are not disregarded. And a lot of you have testified very well to that. But with that in mind, I want to describe a situation, some detail that we face in North Dakota, and get some input if there's time. The Snake Creek Embankment was constructed by the Corps of Engineers at the edge of Lake Sakakawea. Lake Sakakawea is a part of the Missouri River system and created by the Garrison Dam. The embankment creates a separate pool of water that's known as Lake Audubon, and that can be kept at a higher level so that the Bureau of Reclamation can manage that water for its intended uses, such as irrigation, municipal water supplies, rural water, and the Lake Audubon Wildlife Refuge. Again, very good multiple use asset there. But anyway, a few years ago, the Corps realized that they were experiencing some foundation problems with the embankment. The relief wells that they put in place were not properly maintained over the years. And rather than getting to the root of the problem, and despite local objections, which were allowed, the Corps decided to implement a water control plan that would limit how much higher the water level in Audubon could be, of course, than Sakakawea. And so in a severe drought like we're going through this year, it can starve our largest city's water supply. It certainly hurts the shores of the wildlife refuge and misses every priority. So when this was brought to my attention, the Corps simply said they couldn't account for water supply, irrigation, or the needs of other federal agencies in determining the importance of the project, even though the end users were the main reason the embankment was built in the first place. So back to my previous comments. When North Dakotans hear this from the Corps, they see a total lack of common sense. Now, thankfully, General Spellman and his team have been working with me on this. They've been very attentive, but progress is slow, and it's been my experience that they'll find every reason possible not to do something before they ever get to doing it. So I'm not going to ask you to comment on the specifics of this project, but as we start working on another WRDA bill, what's the best way for the Corps to include issues like water supply and irrigation as they prioritize project decisions? And Mr. Mayor, I'd be interested in start with you because I think you probably understand our situation.
Yeah, no, thank you, Senator Kramer. I know the Wildlife Refuge very, very well up there, and some great hunting. That's some good hunting, usually. I think this is just another example of why we need a broader benefit cost analysis. And, I'd like to see the impacts on the ecosystem actually accounted for in a major way. The loss of, the hunting and fishing revenue that comes from that part of the state that's not going to be there if it's dry. You're looking at I think your outdoor economy is, 40 billion, 50 billion across the state or across maybe both Dakotas. And so, I would like to work with you on this because I think it's replicated all across the country. And frankly, if you had a bunch of McMansions that were worth, $3 million a piece lining the shore, you would qualify better than this amazing habitat that's one of the most important in the country.
Anybody else quickly? Ms. Larson.
So congratulations, you stepped on the third rail of water supply. One of the things in particular with water supply, not one of the primary mission areas, these authorized projects have multiple, often competing uses, and so there's this trade-off analysis. And while the Congress seeks to address it, I would also suggest there are so many regional priorities. What are in the upper Missouri Basin states have different priorities than, say, the Southeast, than, say, the reservoirs in Oklahoma and Texas. And then Western water issues have their own character as well. And so we know that this is really complex from an ill-fated core rule that was withdrawn a few years ago. And so this particular issue really needs to strike the balance between consistency on these rules and flexibility to address local conditions. So I don't have the answer for you, but I do sympathize with this plight because it's particularly challenging when you have these control manuals with competing issues.
Thank you all. Well said.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm excited to be part of this kickoff of the WRDA process and want to welcome, I know he's joined us virtually, but Mr. Cordero to this committee hearing. While Mr. Cordero is testifying in his capacity as chairman of the American Association of Port Authorities, he and I go way back, having first met when I was a member of the Los Angeles City Council. So I know from my state and local experience with him how critical the Port of Long Beach in particular, where he serves, is for the economy and for job creation, both locally and regionally, as well as nationally. Familiar because of him with the kinds of proactive investments that ports, both Long Beach and Los Angeles and others up and down the state of California, are making to prepare for the impacts of climate change, which in many ways are already being felt. We're not planning for the future. We're responding to what's happening today. So we no longer have a choice whether or not to deal with the impacts of climate change, and the Port of Long Beach is one that is helping to lead the way. The Port of Long Beach was the first seaport in North America to develop a coastal resiliency plan to address sea level rise and extreme storm events, and to mitigate impacts to port operations as well as local communities. In fact, their 2016 Climate Adaptation and Coastal Resiliency Plan predicted the extreme heat events and resulting outages could stress the regional electrical grid that port operations rely upon. And just a few weeks ago, California faced historical triple-digit temperatures. Mr. Cordero, can you spend a minute telling us how members of the American Association of Port Authorities are preparing for and adapting to the increasing frequency of extreme weather events, including having learned from your experience in Long Beach?
Yes, Senator, and thank you for your question. It's a very, very key and important question. Number one, I think as you've referenced, the whole discussion now with regard to the impacts on climate change has elevated to a very high level, whether we're talking about inland or coastal communities. But to be more specific, I think as it relates to ports, the AEPA's concern is with regard to the impact on ports, with regard to the whole question of weather conditions, extreme weather conditions, sea level rise. And another issue that ports very much are concerned about is, of course, stormwater related projects and the funding necessary to address that. But let me be more specific with regard to sea level. As you know, in the state of California, as a coastal communities here is of great concern. So for example, the state right now opines through a report that was released in the last few years regarding by 2030, sea level rise is estimated to be to about a foot or half a foot. The real concern here is at the end of the century. Some years ago, we were talking about 5 or 6 feet. Now it's 7, and many people believe it's a 10-foot rise. So what does that mean for coastal communities? For California to address the mitigating impact on housing, we're talking about building or the recommendation of 100,000 housing units annually to address this issue. So I think that addresses, again, some of the severe impacts, not only with regard to coastal communities, but of course, the major ports across the country in terms of what that impact is as a result of the severe weather conditions, climate change, and related topics.
Great. And just one follow-up question. I mean, I know in research, in planning, not only for mitigation, but a lot of that is driven by research, data, which has come under fire in recent years, sadly. But with the new administration and new leadership, how else can the Army Corps, and this Congress for that matter, play a role in supporting your climate adaptation and coastal resiliency planning efforts?
A big role that they could play with regard to what's been testified this morning is, again, addressing this whole issue of the beneficial cost ratio to include what the local and regional circumstances should be taken into account with regard to this formula, as opposed to just a national perspective here. And secondly, as has been referenced, the American Society of Engineers recently has now included natural infrastructure as an important component to look to. And more specifically, when you look about the grades that are being given with regard to stormwater, for example, concerns, that grade's a D. So I think, again, these are avenues where I think the Army Corps could be, and I will say that for the Port of Long Beach, we have a very good rapport with the LA District and the South Pacific Division. I recognize that many other ports may not be able to say the same, but in that regard, I think we need to address an important component of how we further the environmental benefits. For example, as I testified, even when you do the question of settlements, the result of our dredging projects, what do you do with that settlement? That's a natural infrastructure resource that we could use in a more beneficial way for environmental purposes.
Well, thank you for your responses. I know my time is up, but appreciate the acknowledgments of the increased use of natural infrastructure and increased beneficial use of dredged material and other things on the natural infrastructure. I know back home in the San Fernando Valley with some of the tributaries into the Los Angeles River, there's tremendous potential for some visionary forward-thinking projects there. And last but not least, heard somebody take a knock at engineers earlier in this hearing. Engineers and scientists have to stick together. Where would we be without engineers and scientists? Right, Mr. Kelly? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. O'Mara, good morning. I want to see if you can expand upon your recommendations for how the Corps should better account for the importance of investing in rural and disadvantaged communities. One important project in Arizona is the Little Colorado River at Winslow Levee project, which was authorized by Congress last year. The entire town of Winslow lies within a floodplain, and current flood control measures do not protect the town from floods. The town has a poverty rate of 23%, and more than a third of the residents are Navajo and Hopi. On paper, this is a competitive project, which will provide significant benefits to the community, yet the project hasn't been fully funded because of the Corps' policy of making funding decisions based on a project's benefit to cost ratio, or BCR. Mr. O'Mara, what do you believe are the best ways we can ensure that communities like Winslow can secure funding for projects such as this?
Thank you, Senator Kelly. It's good to see you again. I think there's two pieces. There's the broader kind of benefit cost ratio analysis that should include more of some of the natural elements, some of the economic impacts beyond just the very top line numbers. But to piggyback off something Mrs. Larson said, I do think that we have to have an equity variable that looks at the values of the properties that are impacted in a different way. We in a Delaware example, we can do a beach nourishment project in Rehoboth Beach much easier because there's multi-million-dollar mansions there, as opposed to upstream where up the bay where you have lower income communities. It's the same thing, and so I think we'd like to work with you and the ranking member and the chairman on getting these equity pieces right, because I think we're going to continue to have these injustices where it doesn't score quite right because the underlying economics are a little different, but they're equally important to and frankly more important in some cases for loss of life.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I look forward, my office will reach out to work with you on that. And Mr. O'Mara, also for you, I want to discuss the importance of the Army Corps collaborating with the Fish and Wildlife Service. While the Corps has done good work in recent years to combat the spread of invasive aquatic species, one growing challenge that we face in Arizona is the spread of invasive plant species, and in particular, the salt cedar, which outcompetes native desert plants for scarce water resources. It grows very quickly, it changes floodplains, creates flooding risks, and it burns hotter and faster than native plants, creating a significant wildfire risk. So these plants are invasive, and they're in the Salt and Gila rivers in the Phoenix metropolitan area, and the removal of these plants is a growing priority for the Rio Reimagined initiative, which was started by Senator John McCain, who previously held the Senate seat. So the last WRDA reauthorization took some important first steps to provide the Corps with resources to combat invasive plant species. But as we look forward, what more should be done to ensure that the Corps has the resources to combat not just aquatic invasive species, but invasive plant species as well?
Yeah, and thank you for the question. I think the salt cedar as an example is particularly egregious, just given the water consumption that it does. I mean, I think across the broader Rio Grande, you're probably looking at 25 to 40 billion gallons of water being sucked up by these trees. I mean, imagine what that would do to flows across the entire region.
And let me say, I did not appreciate the problem until I flew over the area in a helicopter and looked at the Rio Reimagined and looked at how many how many plants there actually are. It's pretty incredible.
Microphone.
Make sure that this committee has the direction to coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
That's Senator Kelly. Thanks for joining us very much. Senator Bozeman and then Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for
joining.
holding this important hearing, you and Ranking Member Capito. Our nation, Mr. McCoy, our nation's inland waterways are considered water highways. The American Society of Civil Engineers reports a $6.8 billion backlog in construction projects and ongoing lock closures that harm industries such as agriculture that rely on the inland waterway system to get their goods to market. Also, we have other areas that are developing, and you need the on and off ramps, to get onto the inland waterways, which again, construction is so important. So delays within the system cost an estimated $44 million per year to the agriculture sector alone. What are the barriers to addressing that backlog and its associated impacts?
The barriers, I see none. The benefit of investing in the infrastructure of the waterways plays so many benefits in the economy, in the environment. So I don't see barriers other than bureaucracy. If there is any, that could be the only barrier. The inland waterway system ticks nearly every box, from the economy to jobs to the environment.
Very good. Ms. Larson, when looking into infrastructure investment, we must consider the lives of all Americans in every state. While extreme climate events in California are certainly different than extreme climate events in Arkansas, we all have a common goal in our investment decisions, and that is to incentivize projects that are effective and long-lasting. A common complaint I hear from Arkansans is how they are frustrated with the slow permitting and review processes and how it ultimately is affecting projects that would improve people's lives in their communities. Will you elaborate on the importance of speeding up the federal permitting and reviewing processes so we can finish infrastructure projects in a reasonable time frame?
Certainly. Thanks for the question, Senator. Recall back in WRDA 14, what that bill did was codify the Corps' 3x3x3 program, which is a study of 3 years, $3 million, and 3 levels of review. As part of that process, what builds in there is the environmental review. The Corps implemented a 2-year environmental review process, and part of that was then included in what was known as one federal decision, which requires all of the agencies to come to the table at the beginning. Don't wait till the end of the day and raise an objection, because then that causes additional delays. So if we look at places where that model was used, it means that the study process is completed efficiently and that all of the agencies are at the table first. And so I think that's a really good model I recall it was the Norfolk Coastal Study which did that. So it was the Corps, it was Fish and Wildlife. Virginia has its own historical board. Everybody got to the table at the beginning of the process to look at the project, to look at the permit, raise objections up front so that you can resolve those and then issue the permit or the planning documents in a timely fashion. So something like that to compel agencies to get together up front and stakeholders, voice your concerns, that will go a long way.
Going along with that, I think that federal policy should not give preference to any one solution over others when addressing water resources issues. I know that the stakeholders in Arkansas would prefer the Corps to use solutions that work best for a particular project and have the support of the non-federal sponsor who is required to financially support the project. Do you believe traditional infrastructure should only be used if the non-federal sponsor can demonstrate that natural infrastructure is not viable for a particular project, or should the non-federal sponsor have more of a say in what works best for their particular project?
So the planning process is structured, and if it works as intended, it's to include all viable options. And viable means, what does the non-federal sponsor want to commit financial resources to? And so if this process works efficiently, include all of those options, including the locally preferred option. And earlier today, we spoke a bit about, particularly flood control projects, the life safety component. So ensure all of those things are at the table. And so as we're looking to, on the one hand, streamline the processes, the permitting and the planning process, I think, we need to be careful, we collectively, not to impose additional regulatory or bureaucratic burdens on this process. That just slows it down, and take into consideration what the local communities want.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, and thank you. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you and the ranking member for this hearing and our witnesses. As we start to take a look at the next round of WRDA authorizations, I know we're not quite finished our water bill yet for this year, but I think it's important that we take a look at these issues. And it seems to me the benefit-to-cost ratio needs to be an issue that we really drill down on and take a look at. How it impacts, I can tell you in my state of Maryland, projects in smaller harbors are very much impacted. I know, Senator Capito, you raised the issue about the rural parts of our state. These dredge projects are so important to a local community, and they get a hard time getting noticed by the Army Corps because of the cost-benefit ratio issues. We had the environmental restoration projects. We have, I think, the Showcase one in Poplar Island in the Chesapeake Bay, which restored 1,000 acres that disappeared as a result of sea level rises and erosion, which has an incredible beneficial impact for the environment. We have environmental justice issues. And then we have the beneficial use of dredge material. We have a very successful program at Blackwater where they were surprised how quickly we were able to restore some wetlands. But there's costs associated with it. We don't get the benefit. So the cost-benefit ratio is something we really need to deal with. I know this has been brought up before, but let me start with Mr. Romero, if I might. We have our second project coming along, which is Mid-Bay, which we are expecting to be able to get some funds in this cycle for construction. But as we look at ways to look at the benefits to our environment or social justice issues or smaller communities' justice, what recommendations do you have on how we could modify the cost-to-benefit ratio analysis?
And Senator Cardin, it's good to see you. I appreciate the question. And I was actually at Blackwater the other day, and the marshes look fantastic. Look, I think for too long we haven't accounted for those costs. I mean, when I was secretary in Delaware, there was nothing more painful than having good, clean dredge fill go to Kilcahook, the landfill in New Jersey, because it was going to cost slightly more to apply it in smart ways to our inland bays. Very similar situation for the Chesapeake. I think having good quantification of the storm resilience benefits, that the habitat value for a range of species, the water quality benefits, the recreational tourism economy benefits, having all those numbers in the basically in the benefit side of the equation. And on the flip side, if we didn't do the project, right, knowing, or we did something harmful in that area, having those costs show up in a real way would level the playing field. I think it'd be much more honest, it'd be much more equitable in real ways. And then also, as you've heard from many panelists, I think we do have to find a different way to incorporate the value of life and property safety. That's not simply just the value of the property itself. Because right now, I mean, we're pushing investments in places where there's just higher income communities are compared to the environmental justice issues that you mentioned.
Thank you. And we have to really see how we do that from an authorizing point of view, because it's challenging to the Army Corps dealing with the budget people, and we really need to give some direction. Ms. Larson, I want to ask if you have any advice as to how we can try to accelerate the small harbor projects that we have on the cost to benefit ratios. We have a huge backlog. Now, one way, just put more money into the program, I understand that, but there's not unlimited resources. Is there a way that we can give a higher degree of priority to our smaller harbors and dredging without compromising the basic structure on how we make these decisions?
So I know through various WRDAs that disbursement of harbor maintenance trust funds allocates a percentage to these small and emerging harbors, and I know that that's a priority for many folks in small coastal areas. So the formula I'm not exactly sure of, and Mr. Cordero, sorry Mario, I'm batting it to you, may be able to talk in particular on those small harbors, but I do think it's critically important when we're considering the BCR and those maintenance dollars, what other benefits accrue from using those small harbors as well.
And then lastly, on beneficial use itself, as you pointed out, Mr. Romero, dredge material can have a positive impact. I know some careers have been started in politics by opposing dredge sites for, it's certainly in Maryland, we can give you some examples of that. Here you have a product that can be used, put to beneficial use, make it a plus. We really do need to have a statement made by Congress as a preference to use dredge material in a positive way rather than trying to find a site that nobody really wants to locate for the dredge material.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we propose in our recommendations is this idea of a resilience directorate that would allow the business lines across the Corps to work together. Because in a lot of cases, we'll have the dredging project, the navigation project, kind of cost one amount, and then we'll have a separate line for the ecological restoration flood protection that costs a different amount. Or if you put the two projects together and you use the clean fill, in appropriate places, ecologically sound, to actually do the restoration work that would actually provide flood abatement value, it would be much cheaper than kind of doing them individually. But we're kind of penny-wise and pound-foolish still on this front, even though this committee's actually made great progress over the last 10 years on this issue. Before 10 years ago, it was a complete mess, and now it's better, but we need to push even faster.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of quick questions too. And Senator Capicaro indicated she doesn't have any more. I'm not sure. I don't believe any other members are going to join us, so this should be mercifully brief. Again, thank you all for joining us today. For Mr. Cordero, the question on environmental justice. Your biography mentions that in your previous capacity as Long Beach Harbor Commissioner, you led an effort to promote and expand outreach to the local community. This, I think it was called Green Port Policy Initiative, worked with the local community to improve the Port of Long Beach's environmental stewardship, and is a nationally recognized and globally influential program to outline sustainable ethics for all port operations. My question would be this: would you explain some of the features of this program and how it created a better outcome for the environment, for the community, and for the port? Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Senator. And absolutely, I think that was an important milestone here for the Port of Long Beach. As you referenced, the Green Port Policy was formalized back in January of 2005. And the plan of action was to address some of the environmental concerns that confront urban ports like the Port of Long Beach. And we did. Primarily the goal to reduce emissions from port operations. And as a result, part of that was community engagement. And I think that was engaging with stakeholders, community associations, neighborhoods. And suffice to say that after a number of years, and in combination with came later, the Clean Air Action Plan, as a result of our partnership with the Port of Los Angeles, we were able to reduce particulate matter from truck operations by upwards of 88%, NOx by 59%, SOx by 97%. And in addition to some of the actions that we did, we moved forward in 2008 with a clean truck plan to replace a rather dilapidated truck drayage that we saw here in port gateways. And today, we have a new dynamic with regard to what these trucks, in terms of what they entail, a substantial reduction in emissions that I've referenced. And our goal is to have, by 2035, zero emission trucks, and by 2030, zero emission cargo handling equipment. And as Senator Padilla referenced, we also moved forward in 2016 with our Climate Adaptation Coastal Resiliency Plan to address issues of climate-related issues and coastal hazards. And today, actually next month, we're going to inaugurate now, or completing our grand endeavor of the last decade, the Long Beach Container Terminal, which would be the world's greenest terminal in terms of an electrified operation. And as I referenced last, again, for 2017, we're moving forward with a zero emission plan of action. All this, we've been very successful, primarily because, again, the outreach that we have and engagement with our community, and more particularly the stakeholders here in the greater Southern California Gateway. So I think beginning with the Green Port policy, it exemplified, at least from our perspective, we were way ahead in terms of environmental, social responsibility that we've exhibited. And going forward, again, I think we're very proud of our environmental stewardship leadership with regard to addressing not only air emissions, but of course, issues like, as I've referenced already, stormwater projects and water quality issues, and of course, very many important issues in relation to, as I referenced here in the state of California, being partners to address the sea level rise that I think is concerning not only to this gateway, but all ports across the nation.
That's a lot of encouraging news. Thank you for that, and for setting a good example for the rest of us. Last question would be for Colin Romero. Deals with natural infrastructure ecosystem restoration, and you may not admit this, but you are regarded as an expert in natural resources management and conservation. And as you know, ecosystem restoration is a primary mission of the Corps of Engineers, but the concept many times gets stuck in that silo. These projects often include nature-based design features combined with gray infrastructure to provide net gains into the degraded ecosystem. But we ought to be doing similar efforts in other projects where the primary focus is flood control or navigation, much like popular island and mid-bay projects that we're hearing about in Maryland. In your opinion, what needs to change at the Corps to break down these silos so that the multi-purpose projects become commonplace, the rule, not the exception?
And thank you, Senator.
Sure.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And and I think this committee's made great progress on this issue over the last many years. It just needs to be an equal playing field. And I think Ms. Larson said it perfectly. I mean, there's places where the natural solution makes sense. There's places where the man-made solution makes sense. And there's places where where you want kind of the green and gray and the sage, if you will, kind of solution. We would love to see much more work, much more focus on the navigation and on the flood protection side. But the idea that we put forth before, this idea of a resilience directorate that would look at solutions holistically across systems. I mean, one of the things we've seen, and we saw this in Delaware after Hurricane Sandy, the places where we had healthy dunes, the places where we had healthy wetlands, fared better than places that only in New Jersey, fared better compared to our friends in New Jersey that only had seawalls in some places. And so like having a place where you can actually think holistically at like a landscape scale about all the different tools and doing that early in the process in a way that's efficient and kind of getting the permitting right. But there has to be that place where folks can talk and break down those silos, because right now, unfortunately, you kind of get down a path and then you end up with kind of a 1950s solution in a kind of 21st century kind of reality that we're living in. And I think breaking those silos down through this kind of resilience directorate combined with the cost benefit piece we've talked about is the key.
Thank you. We're doing joined by Senator Sullivan. I think it'll be our last member asking questions. Senator
Thank
Sullivan,
you, Mr.
welcome.
Chairman. Let me just ask the witnesses very quickly on I think a topic that has a lot of bipartisan support here. It's actually got more bipartisan support in cities with mayors and states with governors, and that's the opportunities that exist to streamline project delivery in terms of the ability to actually get projects done. Unfortunately, our country, relative to other industrialized democracies, on almost every measure ranks last. We all know the kind of parade of horribles. 9 to 19 years to permit and build a highway in America. 9 years, I think, on average to permit a bridge in America. Took 20 years to permit a gold mine in my state, the great state of Alaska. I mean, the list is very long, and it doesn't help the country. I think the only thing it helps is trial lawyers and far-left extremists, environmental groups who don't want any projects built. So can I get a sense from all of you on how important that is? We don't want to cut corners, but, you know, a 2-year, maybe a 3-year period as a goal for permitting, not 9, is really important. What do the witnesses think about that?
I'll start with that. Thank you for the question, Senator, and congratulations to your state for your first gold medal in swimming.
Oh, yeah, wasn't it great?
So we've talked.
She was amazing. 17 years old.
It was amazing. It was amazing to watch.
Seward, Alaska, and, you know, they don't even have an Olympic-sized swimming pool, right? It's just
really
a real
impressive.
amazing young woman.
So we talked a lot about the planning program and the permitting process and then the funding component of that. In terms of the planning and permitting process, back in WRDA 14, the committee codified the Corps' 3x3x3, which is the planning process to get it done in 3 years. As part of that is the environmental review process, and there were benchmarks, including one set by a federal program called One Federal Decision.
Yeah.
Which
Do you agree with that, One Federal Decision?
I do.
So do I.
And I think
Good idea. It's not, shouldn't be controversial. I think
Right.
President Biden got rid of that EPO.
Well,
but
I think, you know, whatever else was in the executive order, I don't know. I'm a nerd who wrote a paper for the American Bar Association on One Federal Decision. But there were many examples that where the resource agencies, every agency and state entities got together at the beginning of the process, raised concerns, it was a much more productive and timely and efficient process.
Good.
And the Norfolk Coastal Study is a good example of that. But I think that you can do that up front. Don't wait till the end of the day to raise concerns. So I think that's an important component.
that's a great idea. Good. Anyone else have a thought on that?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And I mean, you and I have both run natural resource agencies in our past, and I think having that kind of coordination on the front end is important. We also just have to recognize that the agencies have been hollowed out in a lot of cases. I'm really worried about the amount of investment we're talking about, just not having the bodies and the capacity to actually process things quickly.
Yeah,
so
that's a good point.
And so how the sequestration, over the last decade, kind of lands in this infrastructure conversation should be there. But I think a combination of coordination on the front end, and then also I think there are additional. I think there's some kind of policy pieces we should talk about offline for how to make some of the pieces still comply with NEPA, like you said, not cutting corners, but being much more efficient in terms of the timelines.
Good. Well, we want to work with you on that. Let me ask another question. This is an issue that I think should concern this committee, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Capito. I've raised it with the OMB director. I've raised it with the Assistant Secretary for the Civil Works for the Army Corps. But in the President's budget, it says that they will not fund work that directly subsidize, the Corps won't fund work that directly subsidizes fossil fuels, including work that lowers the cost of production, lowers the cost of consumption, or raises revenues retained by producers. When I asked the Corps this, so much of the work that the Corps does is ports, harbors, pipelines. Some estimates of this prohibition would be 40 to 50% of the Corps' overall work. That's a remarkable statement. I don't think the Corps of Engineers agrees with it, but what do you guys think of that? I mean, if you're talking about ports or pipelines, that's a lot of the work that the Corps does that delivers hydrocarbons. Yes, we still need oil and gas. It's not bad. If you're a worker in that industry, I applaud you. I know you're vilified right now by a lot of people in this administration, but these are Americans who have built this country, made it strong. What do you think of this prohibition that would undercut probably 50% of the entire Corps of Engineers budget? Any views? Mr. McCoy?
I'm going to ask you to be fairly brief. We're well into a vote, and we don't want to miss it. Go ahead, please. Just answer the question.
Or you could submit your answer for the record.
Quickly, basing investment decisions upon types of cargo moved could put other types of cargo on the river system in jeopardy and a disadvantage, because the river system is just that. It's a system. We move agricultural products, salt, aggregates, in addition to hydrocarbons.
Yep. Maybe I'll take, if I can get a question for the record on that question I just posed from the witnesses, Mr. Chairman, just
no
to be
problem.
respectful at the time. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Senator Capito, any closing thoughts?
Yes, I just wanted to thank the panelists, in particular, Mr. McCoy, for coming from West Virginia. Great last question from Senator Sullivan. As I see Mr. McCoy's barges go less than a quarter of a mile past my house carrying West Virginia coal. And we should be able to have our waterway systems free and available for those types of, that type of economy. So thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
Senator Capito, our thanks to you and your staff, to our staff, for all the work in putting together today's hearing. I want to really thank our witnesses, Colin Romero. It's great to see you, Mr. Secretary. And with Mario out there in Long Beach, and Amy Larson and Robert McCoy, the real McCoy. We're delighted you could all join us for this time. A lot of work to do. A lot of work to do, and this committee works together, workhorses, and we're looking forward to tackling it and working with the bipartisan staff to do more good work with respect to the Army Corps. I have, I think, one final housekeeping item to do, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a variety of materials that include letters from stakeholders and other materials that relate to today's nomination hearing. Is there objection? Hearing none. Senators will be allowed to submit questions for the record through close of business on Wednesday, August 11th, to our witnesses. And we will compile those questions. We'll submit them to you and ask you to reply by Wednesday, August 25th, if you could. Anything else? Hearing nothing further, thank you all. This hearing is adjourned. Thanks so much.